June 25, 1950. Before dawn, the Korean peninsula erupted into war. Along the 38th parallel, thousands of North Korean troops began moving south. Artillery shells struck South Korean positions. Infantry crossed the border. And behind them came Soviet-built T-34 tanks. South Korea was caught off guard. Its army was poorly equipped to stop a large-scale armored invasion. The first objective was Seoul. The capital stood only a short distance from the border. If Seoul fell, South Korea could collapse. But what began as a war between two Korean governments would soon become something much larger. Within days, the United States entered the conflict. The United Nations committed forces. China would eventually send hundreds of thousands of troops. And behind the scenes, the Soviet Union was supporting North Korea. For 3 years, Korea became one of the most dangerous battlefields of the Cold War. Armies would advance hundreds of miles, then retreat. Cities would change hands. Entire units would disappear. American Marines would fight through freezing mountains. Chinese forces would launch massive nighttime offensives. And eventually, the front line would stabilize almost exactly where the war had begun. Millions would die. Millions more would be displaced. And when the guns finally stopped in 1953, there would be no peace treaty, only an armistice. The Korean War had ended in a ceasefire, but technically, the war had never truly ended. This is the story of the Korean War. Chapter 1. Korea before the war. To understand the Korean War, we have to go back before 1950. For centuries, Korea existed as a unified kingdom and nation. But in 1910, Korea was formally annexed by the Japanese Empire. For the next 35 years, Korea remained under Japanese colonial rule. Then came the Second World War. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. Its empire collapsed. And suddenly, Korea was free. But freedom came with a new problem. Who would control the peninsula? The Soviet Union entered Korea from the north. American forces arrived from the south. The two powers agreed to divide Korea temporarily along the 38th parallel. The line was never intended to become a permanent international border. But the world was changing. The United States and Soviet Union were no longer wartime allies. They were becoming rivals. The Cold War had begun, and Korea was becoming one of its first major flashpoints. Chapter 2. Two Koreas. By 1948, Korea had effectively become two countries. In the south was the Republic of Korea. Its leader was Syngman Rhee. In the north was the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Its leader was Kim Il-sung. Both governments claimed to represent the entire Korean nation. Neither accepted permanent division. Kim Il-sung wanted to reunify Korea under communist rule. Syngman Rhee wanted reunification under the South Korean government. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The Soviet Union provided military assistance to North Korea. North Korea developed a powerful army equipped with artillery, tanks, and aircraft. South Korea's military was much less prepared for a conventional invasion. The United States had also withdrawn most of its combat forces from the peninsula. From Kim Il-sung's perspective, the opportunity was becoming clear. He believed the South could be defeated quickly. But there was still one question. Would Stalin support an invasion? Chapter 3. Kim Il-sung's plan. Kim Il-sung repeatedly pushed Joseph Stalin for permission to attack South Korea. Stalin was cautious. A war in Korea could potentially bring the Soviet Union into direct conflict with the United States. But the international situation was changing. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. That same year, communist forces defeated the nationalists in China. The People's Republic of China was established. The balance of power in Asia was shifting. Kim Il-sung believed the moment was right. Eventually, Stalin approved the invasion. North Korea began preparing. Troops moved toward the 38th parallel. Tanks were positioned. Artillery units were prepared. The plan was straightforward. Attack south, capture Seoul, destroy the South Korean military, and reunify Korea before the United States could intervene. But Kim Il-sung had made a critical assumption. He believed the United States might not fight. He was wrong. Chapter 4. June 25, 1950. At approximately 4 in the morning on June 25, 1950, the invasion began. North Korean artillery opened fire. Thousands of troops crossed the 38th parallel. Tu-34 tanks moved south. South Korean forces attempted to resist, but the North Korean army possessed a major advantage: armor, artillery, aircraft, and combat experience among many of its soldiers. South Korean defenses began collapsing. The North Korean advance moved rapidly towards Seoul. The South Korean government was shocked by the speed of the attack. The United States had to decide what to do. President Harry Truman was informed of the invasion. The conflict immediately became part of the larger Cold War. Truman feared that if the United States did nothing, communist governments might conclude that America was unwilling to defend its allies. On June 27th, Truman ordered American air and naval forces to support South Korea. Soon after, American ground forces would enter the war. The United Nations also condemned the invasion. A multinational force would eventually fight under the United Nations command. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed commander. The United States had entered Korea, but the situation on the battlefield was getting worse. Chapter 5. The fall of Seoul was the first major prize. The capital was dangerously close to the border. North Korean troops advanced rapidly. South Korean forces attempted to organize defensive positions, but the North Korean tanks proved extremely difficult to stop. The defenders lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons. On June 28th, Seoul fell. The South Korean government fled south. The Han River became a major defensive obstacle. Bridges were destroyed in an attempt to slow the North Korean advance. But the South Korean army was already under enormous pressure. The United States rushed troops toward Korea. The first American soldiers would soon discover that this was not the easy intervention some had expected. Chapter 6. Task Force. Smith, the first American ground unit sent into combat, was Task Force Smith. These soldiers were ordered to slow the North Korean advance. They moved toward Osan, but they were badly outmatched. North Korean tanks appeared. American infantry opened fire. Their anti-tank weapons struggled against the T-34s. The North Korean advance continued. Task Force Smith was forced to withdraw. The battle was a harsh warning. American soldiers were not facing a lightly armed insurgency. They were facing a conventional army. The United States would need much more than a small emergency force. It would need an entire military campaign. Chapter 7. The retreat. South American and South Korean forces continued withdrawing. Daejeon became another major battlefield. The North Koreans continued pushing south. Every defeat brought them closer to Pusan. By August 1950, United Nations forces had been pushed into a relatively small area in southeastern Korea. The situation looked desperate, but this final defensive position would become the turning point. The Pusan Perimeter. Chapter 8. The Pusan Perimeter. The Pusan Perimeter became the last major defensive line in South Korea. Behind the United Nations forces was the sea. There was almost nowhere left to retreat. If Pusan fell, the entire South Korean government could collapse. But the perimeter had an advantage. The port of Pusan allowed enormous quantities of supplies and reinforcements to arrive. American troops poured into Korea. Artillery arrived. Tanks arrived. Aircraft provided increasing support. South Korean units were reorganized. The defenders became stronger every day. North Korea launched repeated attacks. Some positions were almost overrun. The fighting around the Nakhtong River became particularly intense, but the North Korean army was running into a problem. Its supply lines were becoming longer. Its units were suffering casualties, and every day the United Nations forces became stronger. Then General MacArthur proposed a risky plan. Instead of continuing to defend Pusan, he wanted to strike behind the North Korean army. The target was Inchon. Chapter 9. Operation Chromite. Inchon was an extremely difficult place for an amphibious landing. The tides were extreme, the waterways were narrow, mud flats surrounded the area. The operation could easily have failed, but MacArthur believed the risk was worth taking. On September 15, 1950, United Nations forces launched Operation Chromite. American Marines landed at Inchon. Naval guns bombarded enemy positions. Aircraft attacked North Korean targets. The landing succeeded, and suddenly the North Korean army was trapped between two advancing forces. United Nations troops were moving out of Pusan, and another force was moving towards Seoul from Inchon. The strategic situation changed almost overnight. The North Korean army began collapsing. Chapter 10. The Battle for Seoul. The battle for Seoul was brutal. North Korean troops defended the city. United Nations troops fought through streets and buildings. Tanks moved through damaged roads. Artillery struck defensive positions. Aircraft attacked targets. Civilians were trapped in the middle of the battle. After several days of fighting, Seoul was recaptured. At the same time, United Nations forces broke out from the Pusan perimeter. The North Korean army was being destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were killed. Thousands more surrendered. Others fled north. The invasion that had nearly conquered South Korea had failed. Now the question became, should the United Nations stop at the 38th parallel, or should it continue north? Chapter 11. The decision to invade North Korea. The original United Nations objective had been to defend South Korea, but victory created new possibilities. Washington debated whether Korea could be reunified. MacArthur supported moving north. United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel. The objective changed from defending South Korea to destroying the North Korean regime. Pyongyang fell. United Nations forces continued north. Some units approached the Yalu River. It appeared that the war might be nearly over, but there was another country watching closely. China. And China had warned that it would not tolerate hostile forces approaching its border. Chapter 12. China enters the war. Chinese leaders feared that a United Nations victory would place hostile forces directly along China's border. China began moving troops into Korea. They moved primarily at night. They used mountains and darkness for concealment. United Nations commanders underestimated the scale of the Chinese deployment. Then, in late October 1950, Chinese forces attacked. The attacks initially appeared limited. Then the Chinese withdrew. Some commanders believed China had merely sent a warning, but the Chinese army was preparing something much larger. In November, the offensive began. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops attacked United Nations positions. The war changed again. Chapter 13. The Chosin Reservoir, one of the most famous battles of the Korean War, took place near the Chosin Reservoir. The 1st Marine Division and supporting forces found themselves surrounded by Chinese troops, and the weather was becoming almost as dangerous as the enemy. Temperatures fell far below freezing. Weapons malfunctioned. Vehicles froze. Wounded soldiers faced deadly exposure. Chinese forces attacked repeatedly, but the Marines and other United Nations units fought their way south. They conducted a fighting withdrawal through heavily contested mountain roads. The objective was no longer to advance, it was to survive. Eventually, the surviving forces reached Hungnam. Ships waited at the port. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated, but civilians were also taken out. The Hungnam evacuation became one of the largest humanitarian evacuations of the war. The Chinese intervention had completely reversed the situation. United Nations forces were retreating again. Chapter 14. Seoul falls again. Chinese forces continued their offensive. United Nations troops withdrew south. Pyongyang was abandoned. Then Seoul was threatened again. On January 4th, 1951, Seoul was evacuated. For the second time in less than a year, the capital had fallen. But this time, the United Nations response would be different. A new commander was taking control. General Matthew Ridgway. Chapter 15, Ridgway. Fights back, Ridgway inherited an exhausted army. Morale had fallen. Units were retreating. Chinese forces appeared unstoppable. Ridgway changed the approach. He demanded aggressive leadership. He emphasized strong defensive positions. He rebuilt confidence. United Nations forces began attacking again. The Chinese advance slowed. Then it stopped. United Nations forces moved north. In March 1951, Seoul was recaptured. This time, the United Nations would hold it. The front began moving toward the 38th parallel. But another battle was taking place far away from the trenches, a political battle in Washington. And it involved one of the most famous generals of the 20th century, Douglas MacArthur. Chapter 16. Truman versus MacArthur. MacArthur believed the United States should fight the war more aggressively. He wanted greater pressure on China. He supported expanding military operations. President Truman feared escalation. China was already fighting the United States. The Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. A wider war could potentially become catastrophic. The disagreement became public. MacArthur openly criticized the administration's policy. Truman eventually made the decision. On April 11, 1951, President Truman removed Douglas MacArthur from command. The decision shocked the United States. MacArthur returned home to enormous public attention. But Truman had established an important principle. The military could advise, but the elected government would decide the war's political objectives. Chapter 17. The war becomes a stalemate. By the middle of 1951, the war had changed. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. The front stabilized. The armies dug trenches. They built bunkers. They constructed defensive lines. The battlefield increasingly resembled the First World War. But there was one major difference. Modern artillery and aircraft made the battlefield extremely destructive. Soldiers fought over hills. Patrols crossed no man's land. Night attacks became common. A hill could change hands several times. And sometimes, hundreds of soldiers could die for a position that would later become part of a negotiated ceasefire line. The war had become a grinding battle of attrition. At the same time, peace talks had begun. Chapter 18. Armistice negotiations. In July 1951, negotiations began. The talks were held at Kaesong and later at Panmunjom. But reaching an agreement proved extremely difficult. One major issue was the future military boundary. Another was prisoners of war. Some prisoners did not want to return to their original countries. The question became highly controversial. Meanwhile, fighting continued. There was no peace. The soldiers were still dying. The negotiators were still talking. For almost 2 years, this strange situation continued. The armies fought. The diplomats negotiated, and the front line barely moved. Chapter 19. The Hill Battles. The Korean peninsula was dominated by mountains. This made high ground extremely important. A hill could provide observation. Observation allowed artillery to target enemy positions. So soldiers fought desperately for individual hills. Battles such as Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and Porkchop Hill became symbols of the war's brutal final phase. The battles were often measured in yards. A few hundred yards of ground could cost enormous numbers of casualties. There was no grand breakthrough, no dramatic conquest of a capital, just soldiers fighting over ridgelines. The war had become a war of exhaustion. Chapter 20, 1953. The final year. By 1953, all sides were exhausted. The United States wanted an agreement. China wanted an agreement. North Korea wanted an agreement, but the details remained difficult. Then, in March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. Soviet leadership changed. The international environment began shifting. Negotiations gained momentum, but fighting continued. In July 1953, Chinese forces launched major attacks in the Kumsong area. The fighting was intense. Both sides understood that the final battles could influence the final boundary. Then, the negotiations finally produced an agreement. Chapter 21. July 27, 1953. July 27, 1953. At Panmunjom, the Korean armistice agreement was signed. The fighting stopped. The military demarcation line was established. A demilitarized zone was created. The armies pulled back. The guns fell silent. But something was missing. There was no peace treaty. The armistice was not a formal end to the war. It was an agreement to stop fighting. North Korea remained. South Korea remained. The peninsula remained divided. The war had begun with an attempt to reunify Korea. Instead, it had permanently reinforced the division. Chapter 22. The human cost. The statistics of the Korean War are enormous. Millions of people were killed or wounded. Millions of civilians were displaced. Cities were destroyed. Villages disappeared. Families were separated. For Korean civilians, the war was a catastrophe. People fled south. Others fled north. Some crossed the same territory multiple times as the front moved. Many families never saw each other again. For American soldiers, the war became known as the Forgotten War. It received far less public attention than World War II, but the men who fought there never forgot it. Chapter 23. Why the Korean War mattered. The Korean War changed the Cold War. It convinced the United States that military containment of communism would require a much larger defense commitment. American alliances in Asia became more important. Japan became strategically important to American military planning. South Korea became a major American ally. China demonstrated its willingness to fight a major foreign power. And the Soviet Union continued supporting North Korea. The war also demonstrated something extremely important. A military victory was not always the same thing as a political victory. The United Nations prevented South Korea from being conquered, but it failed to reunify Korea. China prevented the destruction of North Korea, but it failed to conquer South Korea. Both sides achieved some objectives. Neither achieved everything. Chapter 24. North Korea after the war. North Korea emerged from the war devastated. Cities had been heavily damaged. Infrastructure had been destroyed. But the government survived. Kim Il-sung remained in power. North Korea developed into a highly centralized state. Its military remained central to national policy. Over the following decades, North Korea became increasingly isolated. Its relationship with the Soviet Union and China remained important. But eventually, North Korea developed its own nuclear weapons program. The Korean Peninsula became a continuing center of international tension. Chapter 25. South Korea after the war. South Korea also emerged devastated, but its future would eventually become dramatically different. The country rebuilt. Over the following decades, South Korea experienced rapid industrialization. Its economy transformed, its cities expanded, and South Korea eventually became one of the world's major technological and economic powers. Seoul, the city that had changed hands multiple times during the Korean War, became a global metropolis. The contrast between North and South Korea became one of the most dramatic political and economic differences in the modern world. Chapter 26. The DMZ. Today, the Korean Demilitarized Zone remains. It is one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. Soldiers remain on both sides. Mines remain buried in the ground. Military positions face each other. And in some locations, the distance between opposing forces is remarkably small. The DMZ was supposed to be temporary. More than 7 decades later, it remains. Final chapter: the war that never ended. The Korean War began before sunrise on June 25, 1950. It began with artillery, then tanks, then infantry. And within days, the conflict became international. The United States entered. The United Nations entered. China entered. The Soviet Union supported North Korea. For 3 years, the Korean Peninsula became a battlefield of the Cold War. Seoul fell. Seoul was liberated. Then Seoul fell again. Then it was liberated again. The front moved north, then south, then north again. And finally, it stopped. Not because one side had completely won, but because both sides had reached the limits of what they were willing to pay. On July 27, 1953, the guns went silent. But peace never truly came. The border remained. The families remained separated. The armies remained. And the Korean Peninsula remained divided. More than 70 years later, the consequences of that war are still visible. North Korea still exists. South Korea still exists. The DMZ still exists. And technically, there is still no peace treaty. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War. But it should not be forgotten, because Korea was one of the first places where the Cold War turned hot. It demonstrated how quickly a local conflict could become a global crisis. It showed the enormous cost of military intervention. And it created a division that continues to shape international politics today. The war began with the dream of reunification. It ended with separation. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Korean War. After 3 years, millions of lives lost, and an entire peninsula devastated. The line on the map had barely changed. The war stopped. But the conflict never truly ended.